for inviting me to Nakamura. This is my 7th visit to Japan and my 6th visit to Hokkaido. We came first, this was the first place we came to in Japan in 1990. So we've come back every 3 or 4 years since then, 6 times. And it's always a great pleasure to be here. It's a beautiful campus. We're always very well looked after, and we have learned an enormous amount, particularly from our new friends here. And as some of you may know, this led me to write a book about Japan through the looking glass. And so, I'm going to pass. These are other books.
Other books. Books.
Those are some of the translated books into Japanese. Just to introduce myself, I'm an English, I'm a Scotsman, of course, Alan McFarlane, but I live in England and I teach at Cambridge University. I just retired a week ago, so this is my celebration for retiring, is coming to visit you. My first engagement since I retired. And over the years, I started as an English historian, studying England, and then went with Sarah to work in Nepal. Do you all know where Nepal is? Nepal? Where we work in a village in the Himalayas and have done for many years, 40 years in my case. Then came to Japan and visited here and tried to understand Japan, and then recently I've been working in China, trying to do the same sort of thing, to understand China. So I now then became an anthropologist. I will speak very slowly. Those of you who understand English, like Mr. Bull, will find it very annoying that I speak so very slowly, but I expect it may be helpful for some of you if I speak slowly. Is that the case? And if you can't understand what I am saying, give some indication. If you want to say it goes more slowly, or can you explain that, do so. I would like you, it would be in accord with what I am going to say about language, that I am trying to communicate some meanings to you. And if you don't understand what I am saying, because it's too fast or to a difficult level, then there isn't too much point in me speaking. Anthropologists define ritual. Do you all know what ritual is? Ritual. As you see, this is probably a very slow talk. Ritual, for instance, a mikoshi. You know the mikoshi procession? That is a ritual. Okay? Or when you go to a shrine, and you, that is ritual. They define a ritual as repetitive, standardized, communicative behavior. You go 3 times, and it's no good going, you have to go three times. It's each time you go to the shrine, you go, and it is to communicate between you and the gods and the kami. So that is ritual. If you consider speaking, language and writing, then these are sometimes called by some philosophers of language speech acts. They are things you do with speech, you act. And so they are a kind of behavior which is very like ritual. It is repetitive, you use the same words, you speak in a standardized way, and you try and communicate. So language and ritual are very closely associated. And when you look at ritual, anthropologists have two ways of looking at rituals. One is that it does things, or you try to do things with ritual. It is what is known as instrumental. An instrument is, for example, a bow, or a piano, or a spade. So language is like a spade. You try to do something with this language. It changes the world. It's like a fishing rod or any other kind of instrument. So language is something you use. It is a means to an end. So what you try and do with language, what I'm trying to do with language with you, is to change you, to make you understand new things, alter your lives and your understandings. So language there is an instrument to change the world. Ritual also can be something approached in another way as what is called in English expressive. It expresses, it shows, it makes visible something. So, for instance, when you cry, when you are expressing emotion, you are showing that you are sad by crying. That is expression. In that case, language is just, or ritual is just an end in itself. It is, you just cry to express your feelings. You laugh to express your feelings. And in that case, language or ritual is like art or music. Music, you may use music in certain ways, but music is a thing in itself. Painting is a thing in itself. It is an end in itself. So in that sense, ritual and language is expressive. It's a form of artistic activity. You can express your emotions and your feelings in different ways, in painting, in music, in your gestures, and also in the pattern sounds that come out of your mouth, either in speaking or in writing. Now, I want you to remember that distinction between instrumental, using language to do things, and using language to express things. Because I think it may be profitable to think of English language, which is what I'm now going to talk about, as mainly instrumental, and Japanese language as mainly expressive. When I grew up in England, when I went to school, no one ever really explained this to me, and this is why I tried to explain to Lily, make these things conscious and explain them to her. No one told me, but it was assumed that I was learning languages, I was learning French or Latin or English as a tool, as something that I could use to change the world around me, to communicate with other people and alter the world. It was useful. If you said to your teacher, "Why am I learning French?" they'd say, "Oh, well, it's very useful." This wasn't quite so much the case with some old languages like Latin and Greek, but even there they would say, well, it is useful because it trains your mind to think in a logical way and to understand other languages. So it always assumed that I would learn language and use language to communicate with other human beings to make the world different. Now, the language I learned at my school was English. Of course, I learned it at home as well, but I then continued to learn it and was taught how to write at school. And this language which is we sometimes call English or Anglo-Saxon. Anglo-Saxons were the people who came to England after the Romans, is a very good tool for this instrumental use, as a tool. Those of you who've tried to learn English, how many have tried? I mean, you all seem to speak and understand a little English. As you know, it's a very difficult language for you to learn because the grammatical rules are very weak and you can't really use a set of formula to learn this language. You have to try it out and see, and it seems rather illogical and inconsistent. There are very few grammatical rules and they are very weak. And so many of my Japanese and Chinese students find English a difficult language. They say French is much easier because there are many grammatical rules. On the other hand, when you have learnt it as an English person, or some of my foreign friends, then it is a very powerful language. You learn it much as you learn other things where there are no rules really, or few rules, like learning to swim or learning to ride a bicycle. No one can tell you how to ride a bicycle, or learning how to make a pot, or many forms of artistic activity. You can't really say this is how you do it. You can just notice when someone makes a mistake. If they fall off the bicycle, you can say, well, perhaps you should have been a bit more like that, or something. But you learn to swim or ride a bicycle, and then one day suddenly you can do it. One day you can't do it, the next day you can do it. And no one can tell you exactly how it was. Same when you make a pot, it's suddenly a beautiful pot. And once you can do it, and it has become part of you, then it is a very powerful tool. And it becomes the language that is English, which has led to some of the greatest writing in the world. If you think of the language of William Shakespeare, John Milton, or of Charles Darwin, or of Winston Churchill, or George Orwell, much of the great world literature is written in English. And that is partly because it is a very good language for expressing thoughts in. Maybe not so much, as we have discussed, for expressing emotions, though some of our poets are quite good at that. But for thoughts, it is very good. That is because everything is clear and precise. When we say yes, we mean yes. When we say no, we mean no. When you say hi, you mean yes and no. If we want to make it a bit more ambiguous, in other words, maybe, or perhaps not, we have many conventional ways of doing it. The most famous, one of the most famous in English, is a device which is useful for you to know. And that is if someone says, makes a strong argument to you and says, I think that the Australian people are much better at cricket than the English people. Now you don't want to be in a confrontational argument with them directly. So what you do, or if a student puts a very strong argument to you, you don't say, no, the British are much better at cricket than it's just a temporary phenomenon that the Australians are good. What you do is you use the device of yes, and then you say a few words. But. Yes, but. in English means no. It's like kendo or judo or one of these sports. You retreat. Yes, but. And the listener knows that you are disagreeing, but in a way that isn't too direct or confrontational. So there are ways of saying no and mixing yes with it, but on the whole, we mean precisely yes and no. Another way in which English is very precise is about time. There are many tenses in English, as you probably know. There are gradations of the past. There's the past perfect, the pluperfect, just the recent past, the present, the future conditional, and so on. So we lay out time in our tenses of our verbs in a way which is very precise. You know exactly when a thing occurs, whether it was yesterday, a long time ago, at the moment, is continuing, will happen. And this gives you a precision in your language. Another thing that is very precise is what the subject and the object of the language is. You know who is doing what to whom. The subject, object are very clearly indicated, and this is partly done, of course, through extensive use of personal pronouns. I am talking to you. We are sitting in this room. All the time you know who it is who is speaking, to whom, about what. There is no imprecision at all. Another feature which we tend to take for granted, and I hadn't really thought about until I learnt about Japanese, is that words in English usually only have one meaning. I understand that in Japanese a single word or sound can have many, many meanings, and you don't know what the meaning is except from the context. But on the whole, in English, a word has one meaning. There are some words that have several meanings, particularly in pronunciation. Wait might mean the heaviness of something, or waiting for something, or whatever. But when it's written, it's spelled differently. There are words which have several meanings, but I just thought about it for 2 or 3 minutes, and maybe it was just me. I couldn't think of many examples. So most words just mean one thing. The directness of the language, because it's a very down-to-earth, as we say, very practical, down-to-earth language, it means that if you want to criticize someone or disagree with someone, and there is some power inequality or danger in the situation, you have to use language indirectly. Because if you just use ordinary language in the ordinary way, it is too obvious. You know, if you go up, you say to someone, I think your policy as a Prime Minister is ridiculous and stupid. That is very rude, and also may get you into trouble. So one way around this, and a very important part of speech, particularly in my world of universities, is something called irony. Do any of you know what irony is? Have you heard of it? You've heard of irony. Do other people know what irony means? Well, it basically means saying one thing on the surface and meaning the opposite underneath. So that what you say can be read at two levels. If you take the surface reading, then it may be quite a pleasant thing. But if you know what the person is referring to and what they really mean, you can see that it is very critical. So some of our greatest writers, including Shakespeare, but also poets like Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift, are famous for their use of irony and the more extreme form, which is satire. People like Oscar Wilde, George Vernon Shaw, many of our playwrights and poets used this device. It's a way of appealing to a shared understanding of the situation. You can't use irony if your audience are not trained to read below the surface. And it tends to be used in situations, as in the case of those people I mentioned, Pope and Swift and others, where there is danger. If they had been very critical of the political powers of the time, on the surface they would have been thrown into prison. But they can use, it's like samizdat literature to a certain extent, which is a kind of informal literature which was used in the Soviet Union to criticize. If you have powerful systems in Eastern Europe and Russia before the fall of the Soviet Union, there was much criticism of the system, but it had to be done in a concealed way. So people began to understand the underside of language as it were. Now, this linguistic system I've described arose out of a particular situation in our country about 1500 years ago. Tribes of Germans, Anglo-Saxons, came into the country. They were a very egalitarian people, and by the end of the 7th century, that is nearly 1500 years ago, the basics of our language have been laid down, its grammatical structures and so on. And so it's a very egalitarian language. It doesn't have many what you call honorifics. You don't address people up and down very much, unlike French and most languages which have different languages if you're talking to a superior or an inferior. In English there isn't much of that. It rests on a certain science, on certain epistemology, as we call it. That's a long Greek-based word which means the science of meaning or the relationship, or how you gain knowledge. In particular, and I think this is useful, it assumes a relationship between language, what we speak, and the world around us, and facts, and truth. The English are known as very positivistic. That is, they have a belief that there is a real world there which we can understand, and that each of us sees the same world all the time. It isn't a postmodern world where we each construct reality around us and so on. It is a shared world, and it is real. This cup is a cup, and you're all seeing the same cup, and you all see this cup. So there is an agreed set of observable things, certain undisputable truths and facts external to the speaker. Language describes these things and facts, this cup, for example, and attempts to convey and to discover new facts and convey them these truths which have been discovered to the world. If I say that the tea in here is hot, it is hot. If I say it is cold, it is cold. If I say something is true, it is true. If I say something is false, it probably is false. If I swear, as we do in English courts, to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, then everyone there will say, well, he may, of course, not tell the truth, but there is a truth there to be told, and we all agree on it. Truth and fact are not dependent on personal identity or personality. They're not dependent on the social relationship. They are external to me, and I observe them. This is the basis of our scientific world and our scientific tradition. You don't have that, and that is probably the reason why China didn't develop science, according to, at least if you take on Joseph Needham's argument. The absence of a stable world out there, which everyone will agree about, is probably the basic reason why China didn't develop science out of its great technological background. These facts stand independent, and our language tries to approximate and manipulate the truths. So all our science and investigation is based on that premise, and also our teaching systems, and this is relevant to you as students and teachers. Our teaching system in the West stems from Greek philosophy and Greek thought. And we assume that the purpose of education is the pursuit of the beautiful and the true. You learn the techniques to pursue the beautiful and the true from your teacher, the master of arts, who teaches you to, in a certain way. I don't know if all of you understand how a Western university works, but I, as a teacher in Cambridge over the years, what I do with my students is each week I summon them in, I set them a problem, and this has been going on for 800 years, we're just having our 800th anniversary. For 800 years in this university, you summon a student in, you set them a problem. For example, in anthropology I might say, this week's essay is, can you answer the question, is marriage a universal human phenomenon? Or can order be maintained if you don't have a state? That's this week's question. Here are some books and articles you could read. Come back in a week and tell me what your answer is. The student then goes away, reads, researches, thinks, and comes back with an essay trying to answer this question. And then it becomes a game. The student has their essay and their facts and their opinions, and they are like the person in a baseball game who throws the ball, or in tennis who hits it like this. They throw their opinions and their facts at the teacher. The teacher is the other end and throws it back and says, they say, I think marriage is universal because you find it in all societies. The teacher says, well, what about the society in southwest China, in Yunnan, where they don't have a word for marriage and they don't have any concept of marriage? What about that? And then the student says, well, that may be one exception, but an exception doesn't disprove a rule. There is a rule that marries, and so on. So you have a tennis match, back and forth, or a kendo, if you like, or fencing. And at the end of an hour or hour and a half, each has learned something, but hopefully the student has learned all sorts of techniques of argument, of logic, of fact, and goes away thinking slightly differently and have learned some mental skills. And maybe learn some truths about the world and how to manipulate the world. Because what they're being taught is to use a powerful tool, a tool of power. Francis Bacon of Cambridge, and later Foucault, famously said, knowledge is power. And knowledge is gained for us through language. And the last point, which is that in a highly unstable, the English class system and English society has, for many, many centuries, been very unstable in its stratification, in its classes. It doesn't have fixed classes, and you can move around within the classes very easily if you manipulate various things, particularly money and wealth and education. And the way you move around, and the tool you use above all, is language. The language spoken by the different social classes in England, not just the accent, but also the linguistic codes that are used, are very different. There was a famous study by Bernstein which showed working class language is much more restricted. Devices used are much simpler and restricted than upper middle class English. It's no accident that one of the most famous plays in England, Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw, which was made into a film and so on as My Fair Lady, centres all around language. A working class girl, to become suitable to marry a middle class Englishman, is taught the rain in Spain falls mainly in the plain, and so on. If she can manipulate her language, then she can move up socially. So pronunciation is important, but also all the other tools of language. Rhetoric, logic, grammar, full vocabulary, all those are signs of power. The way I can tell the social class of an English person within 10 seconds by listening to them speak. For instance, if I said to someone, could you tell me the way to, if they say restroom, gents, toilet, loo, lavatory, the choice of how they describe that particular place will immediately tell me something about their social background and social class. So English education is simultaneously about teaching children how to use language both to comprehend and change their world, but also through the right accents and elaboration of speech, how to move around in the social structure. The culmination of all this is that a certain language developed out of the remote and rather barbaric speech of a small group of tribal peoples who flooded into England in the 5th century has now become the language of the world. It may be that Chinese will one day be the language of the world, but I doubt it. I think the Chinese will learn English rather than the English learn Chinese. And it's already happening to a large extent. But certainly at the moment, as you know, it is the world language. It's the language of communications, of the internet, of art and film and everything. It is the most powerful export of Britain, even more than democracy or the scientific revolution in many ways. It's an ideal language for poetry, for drama, for novels of a certain kind, and it's excellent for the pursuit of the sciences. And yet it's only one kind of language. It's an extreme variant of the way language can be used as a tool. And sorry to have gone on so long, but I would now like to hand over to Professor Nakamura, who I think is going to tell us about another kind of language. Thank you.